I think the most important case maybe in Harriet's life was Palikiko and Majors. And yet here's a case where she just came at this case by reason of a conversation that occurred at a cocktail party one night in Honolulu, where somebody said that wasn't it a terrible thing that these two young men were going to be executed in a few days? That's not right. And Harriet said, you know something, you're right. It isn't right.
In March of 1948, two young men, James Majors, 21, and John Palikiko, 19, escaped from an Oahu prison work line. They fled to nearby Nuuanu Valley, broke into the house of an elderly lady, Therese Wilder, assaulted her, and left her bound and gagged. 4 days later, Mrs. Wilder was found dead. The two men were arrested. As there was no evidence of premeditation, they were charged with second-degree murder. But Mayor Johnny Wilson, under pressure, replaced the acting prosecutor with a permanent public prosecutor, Charles M. Haight, a lawyer who happened to be a friend and neighbor of the victim. A grand jury then indicted the prisoners on first-degree murder. They were tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death by Circuit Judge Carrick Buck. The crime and subsequent trial caused a storm of emotion and community conflict. The victim was an elderly white woman from a prominent island family. The perpetrators were two young, underprivileged Hawaiians. Many people felt that a double standard of justice was applied to non-whites and recalled a previous Honolulu case in which white murderers got preferential treatment.
For the first time, there was a recognition that something was wrong in the treatment of poor people. That something that was wrong was a death penalty for killing a white woman. If you were to contrast that with the Massey case, which was the killing of a poor Hawaiian man by white people, and whose sole punishment was sitting in a governor's office for 1 hour, then leaving the state of Hawaii without having served any jail term, then you can understand why the Majors Palikiko case is so important.
After more than 3 years of delays, the new governor, Orrin Long, gave notice that the execution would take place in 1 week. Harriet, Steve, and others worked quickly to gather petitions for clemency. Harriet wrote letters to the editor and went to see the governor. The ILWU, the Hawaiian community, and many church leaders opposed the death sentence. On the morning of the hanging, September 13, 1951, the prisoners received communion and were given final rites. A doctor injected them with a sedative. 15 minutes before the execution, a prison official rushed in to announce that the governor had granted a 1-week stay to allow him to study any new evidence. Letters poured into the governor's office.
Dear Governor, I was certainly surprised to hear that you had let a pressure group of shyster lawyers and communists persuade you to postpone the hanging of the two convicts. Hanging is too good for them. H.A. Kaneohe.
Governor, God gave life to human being and God takes life himself. Let them serve a life sentence and don't hang them. Whoever will hang the boys is just another murderer. Just a housewife. Molokai.
I ask you on behalf of all unprotected women to go on with the hanging, which is too good for these killers. Torture, as they tortured, assaulted, and strangled their poor victim, a lone, aged woman. Mrs. D.
Your Excellency, since the death penalty eliminates all consideration of rehabilitation, its only justification could be as a deterrent to others. Comparative homicide rates do not justify it on that basis. Sincerely, Stanley C. Dahlbeck, Lanikai.
On September 19, 1951, the governor stated that no new evidence had materialized. He set the execution for September 22nd and left Hawaii without authorizing the lieutenant governor to take any action. In the week following the first day of execution, 16,000 people signed petitions asking for clemency.
Helen Kanahele told me before the governor left Hawaii and let that stay run out, he had thrown the petitions in the wastebasket.
At 7 p.m. on the eve of the execution, Harriet tried to secure a new trial for the prisoners, but the judge refused to rule on it and sent her to the Territorial Supreme Court.
So I got Judge LeBaron out of bed and presented the petition to him at 10 p.m. The hearing began at midnight and lasted until 3 a.m. He gave me a stay of execution. The stay was rushed to the prison and got there at 5 a.m., just 3 hours before the scheduled execution.
Harriet produced new evidence. Majors and Palikiko had been compelled to testify against themselves, a violation of the Fifth Amendment. There had been evidence of beating on Palikiko's face, and the men were questioned for long periods of time without benefit of counsel before they were charged with any crime. The Territorial Supreme Court ruled against a new trial.
So Harriet was going to appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court, but in order to get a transcript, it was going to take $2,700. We had to raise that in order to get a transcript of Popper's appeal. So this group of 6 or 7 people, we collected $2,700 in pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters. And the largest contribution was from Lucy Ward. She contributed $25.
Without Steve, Harriet could not have achieved what she achieved. Without Steve, the Palikiko and Majors case would not have happened. Without Steve, who worked tirelessly, doing all of what we now refer to as the grunt work that had to be done.
2 years later, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the Territorial Supreme Court's ruling, and in April of 1954, the United States Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal. 6 years had passed since the crime had been committed. There was yet another new governor in Hawaii, Samuel Wilder King, and Harriet appealed to him to commute the sentence. The governor granted 3 more stays of execution.
And my dad being part Hawaiian also, he was kind of torn because his middle name is Wilder, and the lady who died is a Wilder. And although we're not related, his name came from that family. Harriet came to see me and asked, what could they do to influence my father? I said, just leave him alone and wait.
On Saturday, August 14, 1954, Governor King signed the order commuting the death sentences. 3 years later, due to community pressure, capital punishment was eliminated in the territory of Hawaii.
As history and records, both in Hawaii and elsewhere show, it is only the poor, the non-white, the economically underprivileged who suffer the extreme penalty of death, not the well-to-do or the professional criminals.
I think what we can say is that Harriet Bouslog had a lot to do with the abolition of the death penalty in the state. We are one of the very few states which at least have a civilized attitude towards human life.